Wanted to first thank everyone for being here. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today and share more details about the Suited platforms. We're also proud to be NBLSA sponsors, and so we're really thrilled to be here with everyone. I'm going to share a deck, and we thought we'd start with quick introductions on our team to let you know who we are, and then we'll dive into a little bit more about the platform. Hold on one second. Hopefully that came up and folks can see it. So we'll get started. Amir, why don't we start with you and we'll go right to left on introductions here.
Sure, sounds good. So my name is Amir Oda. I'm the assessment science analyst here at Suited. I help work on the assessments and coming up with the different questions that we do. I'm a recent PhD grad from Wayne State University in Detroit. I've had the pleasure of working with Matt for probably about 3-4 months now. So it's exciting to be in front of you guys. And I know not so long ago, I was in a similar space as you, getting ready for work. And I think it's an exciting and stressful time. And I wish you all the best of luck.
Good evening, everyone, and afternoon for the folks that are coming in from the West Coast. My name is Terrence Yard. I'm a director of strategic accounts here at Suited. I've been with the firm for about a year, but coming from a history of 20 plus years in the fintech space, I worked for a company called FactSet, which applied technology to the global investment banks. And I was primarily responsible for the sales, account management, and customer success of the global investment bank and wealth management division.
And I'm Matt Spencer, co-founder and CEO here at Suited. My background was actually as an investment banker. I was a mergers and acquisitions banker at Houlihan Lokey for about 8 years post MBA, and then subsequently spent another 4 years as the chief human capital officer for the firm, overseeing effectively all the talent management strategies globally for the firm, including recruiting, training, professional development, performance management, DE&I, et cetera. And it was really in that role that the idea for Suited was born, which was to bring technology to bear in our recruiting practices to really help extend our reach and enable a more holistic consideration of the candidates who we were ultimately bringing through our process. We Suited launched our platform for investment banking back in the spring of 2019 after spending a couple of years in early development and beta testing, and then very quickly made the decision that we wanted to move into law and began working with a number of different law firms dating back to sort of middle of 2019. So, 2 to 3 years now, we've been working with a lot of different firms to build the platform specifically for the legal industry. And we're going to talk to you in a lot more detail today about how the platform works and give you some insight into it. To start off as a quick overview, Suited is a predictive recruiting network that's designed to help most promising students from all backgrounds access those career opportunities in law. And we combine proven assessment science out of the field of IO psychology with cutting edge data science, specifically artificial intelligence, in order to build customized and AI driven models to help firms make better, less biased hiring decisions. And then in turn, help more candidates access more firms and be given a real chance to prove their potential regardless of the background and academic pedigree. Just to give you a sense of our partners and how we approach the market, you can see here the logos of the law firms who we're currently working with. This list is perpetually out of date because we continue to add more and more firms. We always keep, for your information, an updated list of the firms that we work with on our website. So as we continue to roll that forward, you'll see more and more names added. We are fortunate that in the time that we've been doing this, we have never lost a partner. So between law and investment banking, we've never lost a law firm who we started, or law firm or investment bank, we've never lost a client who we had started working with. The reason we really talk about these as partners is because that's how we approach the market. Even from the earliest development stage, our goal was to partner with the industry to build a platform for the industry. And so some of these firms, as I mentioned, we've been working with for almost 3 years now. Two other individuals that I want to highlight who are incredible resources for us are Angela and James, both shown here. They are 2 of the 5 members of Suited's corporate board of directors and have oversight across the entirety of the business, but also have deep backgrounds in big law. Angela spent 17 years between Jones Day and Arndt Fox, left to become the first chief diversity officer at Texaco, and then subsequently at Colgate-Palmolive, and now founded and runs a consulting firm that advises law firms in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. James was actually the first ever Black partner at Wachtell Lipton, spent 15 years in total at Wachtell Lipton before ultimately leaving to join President Obama's administration in a couple different roles, culminating as the Deputy Secretary of Education. And he now runs a hedge fund in New York. So between James, Angela, and the entirety of our law firm partners, that really makes up the brain trust that helps us build and ensure that our platform that we've launched heretofore, but also as we perpetually develop and build on top of it, is going to be most relevant for the industry and really impact the issues that we are focused on. So with that, I want to get into a little bit and start about talking about what those issues are. What are we really trying to solve for? So historically, the recruiting process for law firms was about shrinking the pool of candidates, the possible pool of candidates, down to a size that was actually going to be manageable in their recruiting process. So how did they shrink that? It was by relying on, classic resume markers such as law school rank, GPA, et cetera, in order to take that pool of potential candidates, which is everybody who's currently in law school, and shrink it down to a size that they could actually manage. The problem with that, as we'll talk more and more about and share data with you that will support these conclusions, is that not only are those markers that they were using to shrink the pool not particularly predictive of long-term performance, they also had a ton of systemic bias wrapped up in them, causing perpetual negative impacts and effects on their process. So what we find historically, and again, we'll share this data with you, is that resumes tend to be better predictors of past privilege than they are really of future potential, which is what we want to measure in the hiring process. It's about trying to find who is going to end up being a high-performing attorney. And the information and the data that we'll share with you that's part of our assessment has a much better way of ultimately coming to those conclusions. So our approach, just to sum it up, is really instead of shrinking the pool down to be small enough that it can be managed in a process, our approach is about leveraging technology to scale up our ability to consider the entire pool of candidates and to consider them in a much more holistic manner. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Terrence, who's actually going to walk through a little bit of this background data to support those conclusions.
Thanks a lot, Matt. As he talked about, one of the big things that we're trying to do is, as he used the phrase to scale up, is to expand the reach that firms actually look to in identifying potential candidates. And the real thought process there is that firms are going to have a consistent problem meeting representation goals unless they fundamentally rethink the way that they approach, the way that they include students in the process, unless they're doing it from a much wider range of schools. And it's really kind of basic math that drives that thought process. We looked at data from the National Association of Law Placement on the number of 2L summer associate positions, and then compared that with the percentage of students that go into private practice versus going to government, not-for-profit, public interest, clerkships, et cetera. When you look at that comparison, you need to start with a potential candidate pool of at least 1,500 Black law student candidates in order to fill the approximately 750 spots that would be required for the industry to show representation and parity with the US population. You take that one step farther, looking at the Bar Association's data on law school demographics, for using the 2020 as an example, you don't reach a representative pool of 1,500 Black law student candidates until you get out to the 110th ranked law school. So clearly, based on the way that schools are approaching it now, they're never going to be able to do a more lasting and a long arc of increasing representation, though they might be able to do better one year to the next on individual metrics and placements. They're constantly going to struggle to reach this kind of meaningful and long-standing change without really kind of readdressing the issue in the way that we're discussing. The other piece, as we move on, is expanding not just the reach, but expanding what you consider. When Matt started the conversation, one of the things he pointed out is, and as we all know, that the resume tends to be the key screening tool, and it's rife with all sorts of problems. And let's be clear, right? We're not saying that there's no value in looking at the resume, but it does introduce a lot of unintentional consequences that don't help the problem at all. If you're looking at the graphic that we're showing here, this is what we call an explained variance. We've had the advantage of the years that we've been working with our law firm partners to assess and to review thousands of incumbent practicing attorneys across that entire partner network. If you were to stack rank all of those lawyers from the highest performer to the lowest performer, and then try to correlate their performance based on any individual resume marker, you'll find that there's very little predictive power in those markers relative to the weight that gets put on them in the selection process. Using something like GPA or law school rank, you'll see that explains a very small percentage of the difference in performance from that highest performer to the lowest performer. And interestingly enough, across every single firm, we see this exact same pattern. Matt also talked about how we started the business in the investment banking side. Of all of our investment banking partners, this same pattern holds true. So clearly what we're finding out from this, using data from these firms, is that there's very little explanatory power or predictive power of the resume markers that are being used to shrink down the market.
So understanding that backdrop that we're working in, trying to bring better, more predictive, less biased metrics into the equation, want to talk about our approach. So Suited really helps firms go beyond the resume by bringing additional data into the process, data that's both way more predictive of future performance in that graph, and we'll show you that in a second, but that is also substantially less biased. And we do this really by leveraging two different types of assessments. A psychometric assessment and then an essential competencies assessment. We're going to go into both of those in detail in a second. Amir is going to really dive deep on those for us. But importantly, these assessments that we developed were specifically designed for law. All of the characteristics were validated as being relevant for law. We followed the best practices from the field of IO psychology, which Amir can talk about and cover as well. But importantly, it was really designed specifically for this use case and to measure if it's not the resume, as we just saw on the chart before, if it's not GPA, if it's not going to a top-ranked law school, that's truly being predictive of performance and determining whether somebody's going to be a successful attorney or not. What is it? That's what we're ultimately looking to define with part of this. When we do that, Terrence talked about our process of collecting data across incumbents from all of our different partner firms. And he mentioned we've done thousands of assessments across all of our partner firms, the same assessment that candidates ultimately complete. And when we look at that data and then leverage artificial intelligence to build predictive models around what combinations of characteristics are truly driving performance for firms, what we're able to get to is an outcome that is now in between 34 and 47% of that explained variance. So if you think back to that chart that Terrence was describing that showed 5.5% is what the resume is contributing to whether or not somebody's ultimately going to be successful. All this additional data interpreted by the power of artificial intelligence allows us to get to a much greater understanding of any one candidate's potential and fit for a particular firm, which is another big piece that we'll talk about. I know Amir is going to cover this as well, is that we build these customized models on a firm by firm basis because there are firms where candidates may be a better fit than not. And that's really a big part of our process, is helping to define what is it that drives success at every individual firm that we're ultimately working with. The second piece of this that we talked about is the adverse impact side. I want to break this chart into two pieces. The left-hand side being a classic review of a review of a classic marker like GPA. We took the 7,000 law students who came through the Suited platform over the course of 2021 between the two cycles, the January 2L cycle that was shifted because of COVID, and then the subsequent August 2L cycle that happened in the normal calendar. We took those 7,000 candidates and drew just a straight GPA cutoff. And when we do that, what you see is that there's substantial adverse impact created against various demographic groups. Black, Asian, and Hispanic students are all varied selections relative to benchmarked against white students. And what that ultimately is showing is that if firms are drawing a hard GPA cutoff, then they're creating adverse impact against those various different groups. That is the systemic bias that we're seeing wrapped up in all of those things that come to form things like who gets into top law schools, who ultimately is getting high GPAs, various different entrance exam scores like the LSAT. There's systemic bias wrapped up in all of those. What we want to do is set those things aside. Not necessarily exclude them entirely, because as Terrence talked about, there is predictive value there, but the amount of emphasis that's put on it in the process is dramatically different than the predictive value it actually adds, where in a lot of cases it becomes almost a singular knockout factor. You're above the line or you're below the line based on that GPA as to whether or not you even get into the process. And the reality is, not only is it creating all these adverse impact and perpetuating diversity issues, it's also not particularly predictive. When you look on the right-hand side, you can see what the selection rates look like when we're able to bring predictive recruiting measures like Suited into the platform and look at selection rates of candidates that is now using a variable that's substantially more predictive. And as you can see, selection rates start to equal out to a more one-to-one type ratio because we're removing all of that bias from the process. Terrence, I'm going to hand it back to you to talk about sort of the next steps here.
Sure. So as it relates to you, who are watching right now, how do you engage with Suited? Probably the most important thing to point out is no one benefits from anything if there are disincentives put in place to use it. And so for that, I'll make it very clear from the beginning, students do not pay to engage with students. We charge the firms to be able to interpret the data and use the platform in that sense. We recommend coming to Suited and taking the assessment in advance so you're ready for the process when it starts. We think about it now in the calendar as time flies. OCI is about 5 months away. Our recommendation is come in and do it early, because once the process starts, it is chaotic, it is compressed, and you're going to be laden with lots of other things that you need to do. Getting it out of the way early when you have time and can do it in a thoughtful manner, we think is probably one of the best practice recommendations that we can give you. You can come to Suited as what we call a public candidate. That means you're coming to the platform directly, creating your account, and before being invited by a firm that you're going to be potentially interviewing with. We also recommend that as you take the assessment, that you don't try to model what you think is the behavior or the answer that a firm would be looking for. And the specific reason for that, we call it truthful revelation. Using all of these psychometric attributes, you'll notice, and as Matt talked about, every firm has a very different profile. So if you think you're modeling for one, you could very well be working against your best interest for another. So we really want you to, as you come to the platform, to really take your time and present yourself in the way that's most reflective of the person that you are. The last way is to be invited by firms who are also on the platform. If you remember back to that early slide, there were about 15 different logos that were on there. Each of them uses Suited as a requirement as part of their process. By getting in early, you're making yourself available as a public candidate to all of the firms that are around the platform, versus if you wait for being invited, you'll be presented for that firm. Obviously, as other firms bring you in, you can leverage the same assessment, but you're limiting sort of the exposure that you get across the entire network. Maybe we talk about the benefits, Matt.
Yep.
We want you to be exposed as widely and as holistically as possible. And that's what Suited is really working working to do. The advantage that you have here is that all of the firms that are on the platform are already committed to expanding both the schools that they consider from and how they consider their candidates. So by definition of coming onto the platform, you're increasing your chances of being discovered by firms that may not even recruit at your school. You're getting your foot in the door, presenting more than just what you look like on an 8x11 piece of paper. And you're being evaluated by a lot more than that resume could ever indicate as they evaluate resume drops. And I think probably one of the more important pieces is, as the firms use Suited and evaluate the scoring that comes through it, you have a much higher likelihood of ending up in a firm where you're predicted to succeed. And that's ultimately the solution to the long arc of the problem, right? Ultimately, performance is determined by a number of different things after you get hired. But if you are aligning along those same psychometric attributes and the same competencies that those firms value and that correlate to performance in their incumbent employees, their incumbent attorneys, it reasons that you will have a much higher likelihood of success in your pursuit of your career at that individual firm.
And with that, we're going to hand it over to Amir, actually, to go into a little bit deeper dive to give you some insight into. We talk about the assessment, we talk about the characteristics that we're measuring. We want to share more with you so that you're familiar with what are those characteristics, what are those things. And so, Amir, I'm going to hand it over to you to really walk us through some of the details of the assessment here.
Thanks, Matt. So I'm going to try to help you understand the assessment in a way that maybe, when you see an assessment, there's a bit of a smoke screen there as to understanding what exactly is going on, what's being measured. So the hope here is that by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of what's going on in the background, so that when you answer it, you're not accidentally hurting yourself in the process, but you're in fact optimizing your chances. So one of the things that's most important that we measure at Suited is personality. Many of you are familiar with typical personality measures from quizzes you may have taken, whether it's something fun for between friends or coworkers, or for work purposes. But personality can be a little bit more complex than whether a person is introverted or extroverted. We can take a look and see if a person tends to be more results focused or more quality focused, if they're more independent or if they're more collaborative. And you can perhaps start to see how these sorts of traits make a person more or less suited for one workplace over another. Next slide. So when we're measuring these things, we're picking and choosing our personality questions on the basis of how job related they are. So if there's no link between what we're asking and the work or workplace, then we're simply not going to ask that question. All of the items we use are pilot tested to make sure that they are related to the work that you're doing before we ever include them in our predictions. So what you're seeing in front of you here is a sample of firm results. So these are a visual representation of what a set of scores might look like at one particular firm. So again, I want to emphasize this is a sample firm. Different firms will have different maps for where people fall in each of these traits. And you'll note that in some of these personality measures, they lean more heavily in one direction, so further to the right, or in another, so maybe further to the left. We can think of this as the unique landscape that exists within the firm. What we look for is how well any individual might fit into a particular landscape of traits. So we recognize that, and we try to celebrate that every individual has a unique constellation of traits that define them. And we also recognize that for that reason, they may thrive in one environment over another. So we focus on matchmaking people to the environment that we believe they'll see their greatest potential in. We also want to pay special attention to the values that people have. Values are these things that define us, and one can certainly imagine how they might define the behaviors we engage in while at work. So similarly, though, organizations may be defined by their values, and those values may play a role in the way that the work there is conducted. So at Suited, we're committed to matching not only the personality of an individual, but also the values of a person with the firm that they're applying to in order to get a better experience for the candidate. So if we think about how different firms value something like tradition, we can see that some high performers in certain firms might use established approaches, where in other firms in our platform, they might incentivize their workers to be more innovative and come up with original approaches. Depending on where you fall, you might be a better fit for one company over another. So let's take that a step further. If we think about something like companies that work with tech startups, well, then innovation is pretty important to them. Whereas we might also have these large firms that are more traditional and they just want to continue on with what they're doing. So you can see how your approach might better suit you for some organizations over another. So values and personality, they're important and they can define us in our day-to-day. But what in the case of a stressful event? We take the time to ask you about how you deal with stress so that we can help you end up in a place that will better aid you in dealing with stress at work the way that you prefer. So I want to emphasize here that this isn't about how well you deal with stress. We don't ask about that. What we ask you is, how is it that you deal with stress? So we can bucket this dealing with stress into one of three categories. We can describe it as active coping, positive reframing, or social support. So active coping is dealing with stress by putting your head down and working hard. Positive reframing is finding relief by looking for the silver lining. And then social support is using your network of colleagues and friends to help alleviate the stress. You might have used any one of these methods, and perhaps you know very smart people who use different coping methods. And I want to emphasize that we're asking about this so that if you prefer social support in dealing with stress, you don't end up in a place where everyone just prefers to put their head down and work, because you can see where that might potentially clash. So up until this point, I hope it's clear that the question pertaining to personality, values, and stress, they don't have a correct answer. Every person is different, and those differences may help them be a high performer in one company, but less effective in another. What you're seeing in front of you is a sample question on one of our psychometric assessments. So you can see it's a pretty straightforward question. There's no tricks here. It's just, how does this best describe you? And then we eventually accumulate all of these to develop a profile for that hopefully matches as best as we can who you are. So now we'll talk about essential skills. Essential competencies. While this is the case for most of these questions, that we don't actually, we don't have a right answer for questions, this is the portion of the assessment that does have right answers. We have a section of our assessment that addresses innate skills. Previously, in order to assess this, schools have relied on GPA and school to assess how well a candidate might perform in the future. But we also have, as Matt alluded to, as Terrence alluded to, this does very little to predict long-term performance. And we also know that this is baked in systemic biases. So what Suited does differently is we aim to measure innate skills that are job related. So we do this by focusing on three major components of work-related skills: attention to detail, critical thinking, and logical reasoning. Oh, we can go back, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Jumped the gun, my fault.
So with all these assessments, it's important to know that we don't want to disregard everything you've ever done and focus only on what you've measured, on what we measure. We also gain important insights from your academic history, such as the skills that you already possess, in aiding us in matching you to a company. Again, they might not be the heavyweights in our prediction, but we still want you to have an opportunity to demonstrate your commitment to your profession. So on the next slide, what we have here is an example of what an essential competency question might look like. We focus again on trying to capture innate skills while minimizing things that might be that might have been influenced by systemic biases. So here we have a very simple matching question where you would check mark whether or not an item matches, or one of the options matches the example set of letters and symbols. So again, what we're trying to do at Suited when we're talking about measuring essential competencies, or when we talk about measuring personality, is we're not trying to disregard all of your academic history, your participation in clubs, your work with GPA, your hard work in getting a high GPA, whatever it might be. What we're doing is just making sure that we measure those things and we account for those things in a way that's appropriate. So if it's predictive, but it's only slightly predictive, then we only use it in a slightly predictive way. We will use the other things that we gather, from the psychometric assessment, from essential competencies assessment, to make sure that we are accounting for you as a worker, as a person who will be working at a firm, and using those things to predict your performance. So if you think about the concept about how you work and how you get things done, that is one of the things that we use in order to let me take a step back here. So when we're talking about the things that we've measured, whether they're essential competencies or psychometrics, we take all of those questions that we've gathered and we reevaluate them across what we've termed as 3 dimensions of work. So one of those dimensions of work is getting things done. And getting things done is talking about, how or what is the method that you take as you approach a question. And so many of our competencies that we've measured in our psychometric assessment or in our essential competencies, they get at that. But the power of AI that we use is that we can take a look at the combinations of those competencies and inputs, and we can use them to more accurately reflect the differences between a high performer and everybody else. And so to illustrate this point, if we take a look at that first bar, if you take the competency of analytical thinking, which measures willingness to think carefully and deeply about complex problems, and we combined it with our competency of dependability, which is seeing things through and not willing to give up on things, you end up with this description of a candidate that is far more predictive than either one alone. And so we are better able to then take a look at not just something, it's not just about taking a look at how high a person scores on analytical thinking or how high a person scores on dependability, but it's the unique constellation and combinations of these traits and competencies that allow us to then make an assessment of how well a person might fit into a firm. And if you think about it in another way, it's one thing to think about a competency like analytical thinking as a test taker and say, I have to score really high on this. It's a whole nother game to say, I need to match the exact constellation of traits that a certain company is looking for. And so really a test taker's best strategy is to answer honestly, because not only do different firms have different needs, you might end up creating a fake personality that doesn't exist in any of the firms. So the employees that take the assessments, so when we're creating these assessments, we go to employees at these firms and ask them to also take these assessments in order to understand what the firm looks like. And as you can imagine, these employees are not under any pressure to answer these questions. They don't feel that they have to represent a certain personality, at least not in the same way that a candidate might. And so when you're creating or when you're answering these questions, it is in your interest to similarly adopt that strategy of representing yourself as best as you can, because that's what the employees are doing. So what you really want to do as you're taking these assessments is take a deep breath, try not to feel all the pressure, and tell us who you are, because just like that's how the employees at these firms are taking them.
There's 2 things that I want to append to this, and thank you, Amir, for what a great walkthrough. Two things that I want to append to this, and I don't think Amir will take any offense when I talk about IO psychology historically, as we think about the old way of using IO psychology versus the new way. The old way of using IO psychology-based data to make hiring decisions was about measuring a certain set of characteristics, seeing which ones were statistically significant in terms of predicting future performance or statistically significant in your high performers, and therefore creating this archetype that you're only going to hire. That's what's statistically significant. So we're only going to hire people who have that characteristic. And what was created were these classic sort of archetypes that we're just hiring the same type of people over and over and over again. By combining the tried, true, proven science of IO psychology with the computing power of machine learning, we're able to assess all these different complex interactions and all these different characteristics, whether they're nonlinear characteristics, more of something isn't always better, less of something isn't always worse. Sometimes there's a Goldilocks zone. Also looking at how these things combine, we're able to get to the realization that there may be 100 different ways to add up all the things that we're measuring to create high performers in a particular firm. We're looking at 100 unique data points as part of that process, over 100 unique data points, but we're looking at 10,000 different statistical combinations of them. And that becomes a really exciting thing when it allows us to now really understand human potential. One example that I like to use, two things that people tend to understand: introversion and extroversion, right? Most people are familiar with those terms. We don't measure introversion and extroversion in our assessment. I'll be clear on that. But you can imagine somebody who scores on the extreme introverted side of the equation being a very highly successful attorney. Just like you could imagine somebody who scores on the extreme extroversion side of the equation also being a very high performing attorney. So it's not, are they introverted or are they extroverted, that is making them a high performer. It's what's the combination of characteristics they're putting around it. That's really what's exciting about this, and using the advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning to interpret this data. The other critical thing, I want to link this back to something that we talked about back earlier in the presentation. The other thing that's exciting about this is, unlike human decision-making, machine learning-driven decision-making can be tested for bias. I shared with you the results of the adverse impact tests that we do against GPA versus against our models. We test every single one of our models that we build for our firms. You can imagine when we're building models on incumbent attorney populations at law firms, those are relatively homogeneous data sets that we're ultimately assessing. So we have to be super careful that we're not picking up and perpetuating biases that exist there. The assessment was designed to measure things that don't show bias, but expected is not good enough in hiring decisions. We need to be certain. So all the process that we've gone through to build and develop the assessment that's not expected to show bias, we test. We test it over and over and over again. We test every single model we build for firms against the entirety of our candidate pool and the growing candidate pool. So we had 7,000 candidates come through in the 2 cycles in 2021. We're already over 10,000 now. Much more representative sets that we're continuing to grow and build and to use in our testing. We test every model that we build for firms at the point of deployment, but also perpetually through the lifetime of that model's use against the ever-growing candidate pool, so that we can ensure that the selection rates that are resulting have nothing to do with demographics, and that we've created a bias-free algorithm to serve as a check and balance in the recruiting process, and an additional data point that firms can ultimately rely on. I want to bring this, and we've got 2 more slides here, and then I know we've got some great questions that are coming in, which we certainly want to address. 2 quick case studies that I want to share that I think will highlight for you how this can ultimately come into play in the process. This first case, and these are real case studies of candidates who came through the 2021 cycle. Both of these candidates actually came through the January 2022 cycle, January 2021 2L cycle. So that means that they were hired in the January cycle and then actually performed as 2L summer associates this past summer. This first case study is a candidate who went to a non-target school for this particular firm and had a GPA of 3.4. When the candidate completed the assessment for this particular firm, we were identifying that there were several characteristics, and we're highlighting some of them here, that were correlated with high performers. Things like high resilience, high dependability, high conformity. Again, these were things that were predictive of performance for this particular firm. There was a low, something that was more correlated with their average type performers. Ultimately resulting in an 87%. The way we always boil our evaluations down is to a percentage that's a probability. That 87% says that candidate, after completing the assessment and scored against the custom model for this particular firm, has an 87% probability of, when they come on the platform, being similar to or achieving performance rankings similar to high performers. That's what it's saying. We importantly don't ever present it as hire this person, don't hire this person. It's always presented as a probability to give them an understanding of how closely that person aligns with their existing attorneys and what's made folks successful, their preferred ways of working and the values and all the different things that Amir talked about in terms of those matches. Ultimately, when this candidate came on as a summer associate, performed extremely well. So despite having gone to a non-target school and having a GPA that was, I believe they had a 3.5 cutoff, so not significantly below, but slightly below that range, this candidate got an opportunity to go through the interview process, not only did well, ultimately got hired, and when they came on board over the course of the summer, really performed well, full-time offer, and is returning to the firm as a full-time associate after they graduate. So that's an exciting way of thinking about breaking down those resume biases, those things that we've talked about on the resume. This second case study really gets us excited because I think it's another great use case of how this can impact the process, not just at the resume stage, but also throughout the interview process. So this particular candidate was a woman of color who went to a T14 school and had a GPA of 3.5. So back to our on paper resume metrics, was a really attractive candidate for this particular firm. But when the candidate went through the callback interview process, they had an interview with 4 people. 2 people said no, we're not going to give her an offer. 1 person said maybe, and 1 person said yes. So the hiring committee, when they're looking at those evaluations, ultimately said, okay, based on this interviewer feedback, we are not going to give this woman an offer. But they then looked at the suited data and the evaluation, and at an 84% probability, she was one of the highest scoring in their callback class based on the suited models and algorithms. So they said, you know what, this is back in January, remember, so first cycle out of launch. They said, this is a great opportunity for us to really test and see, does this suited thing work? Does it lead us to different conclusions that are going to create better outcomes for us? So they decided to give her an offer based solely on this data. And not only was she accepts the offer, comes in for the summer. Not only did she perform well, she ended up the highest rated summer associate in their entire summer associate class. Universally, like, positive feedback, absolutely crushed it. They give her a full-time offer at the end of the summer. She accepts, returning, and everybody's thrilled. And we actually shared this case study along with some additional post-cycle analysis that we do with all our firms, where we're looking back at the process, what went well, what needs to change, et cetera, et cetera. We shared this case study with the hiring committee who were at this particular firm. And when we got to this one, the name obviously is blinded here for you all, but we were sharing it with that firm. We were talking about this particular candidate. One of the hiring partners put her hand up and she said, listen, I was one of the no votes in the interview. I interviewed her and I was a no vote. I subsequently worked with this woman over the course of the summer, and she is every bit as amazing as the feedback shows. And I missed her. I missed her in our hiring process. Our process missed her altogether. We didn't see her. And that's really what this is about, is helping firms see candidates that they may not otherwise be seeing because they never make it into their process, but also see beyond these systemic blockers that are existing because we're so wrapped up in the biases of law school rank and GPA and the classic things, because those used to be the only metrics that we could actually quantify. And because we're bringing this technology that helps understand somebody much more holistically and create these better matches, we can really help firms see the potential that every single candidate has and get past all of these other issues. So with that, I'm going to pause for 1 second. I know Jess on our team has been collecting questions, and we're seeing them come in the chat. So we will start taking a couple questions here that have been submitted along the way. Happy to also, as we go through these, if folks want to raise their hand, want to come off mute, want to submit more questions to the chat, we're happy to do this. We've obviously got another 12 or 13 minutes, which means we're right on time. We plan to have about 15 minutes for the end, and sometimes we get a little long-winded. So we'll start taking questions, and then if there, like I said, if anybody wants to come off chat, we're happy to have a conversation. So the first question we've got is, if I've already taken the suited assessment, will I be able to reattempt my entry at some point? This is actually going to correlate a little bit to the second question, which is, can current 3Ls use the suited platform? Because there's timing issues related to both of these. So one of the great things about the platform is to make it not obtrusive, or as unobtrusive as possible in the recruiting process, is that it's an assessment that you only take one time. right? So you take it, so all the different firms on our platform leverage the exact same assessment, the exact same results. And so we only allow you to take it one time. You only have to take it one time as part of that process. During the recruiting cycles within campus, right? So that is a one-time thing. You don't have to retake it, don't need to retake it, aren't able to retake it. But again, back to a lot of what Amir was saying, the things that we're measuring as part of this assessment are really more immutable competencies and principles. Competencies being the IO psychology word for characteristics, right? So these are really more immutable characteristics. They may change, but all the studies that have been, and we didn't reinvent the wheel from an IO psychology standpoint, all of these things have been studied for decades and decades. These characteristics may change on a 10-year timeline type basis, but they're not changing year to year, month to month, et cetera, et cetera. Even over a course of 3 to 5 years, we don't see these things ultimately change, which is why we only have the assessment be available one time. To link that to the third question, so can 3Ls use suited? Absolutely. The one caveat to that, because I want to be fully transparent, is the use of suited is really going to be tied to the firms that are working with us and their needs. So if firms have 3L needs, you will be picked up and asked to complete suited as part of that process. If the firms who are partnered with us don't have 3L needs, then I don't want to tell you to, hey, go take it, because there's going to be a slate of opportunities that are out there. It's all going to be tied to the firms that we're working with and what their 3L needs may be. Now, this year, I know there were firms who went back to the 3L market because they underhired in 2Ls in the last cycle, given all the COVID things that are out there. So there are firms that are looking for 3Ls. What I would recommend is you're welcome to come to Suited directly, as Terrence talked about. I would also just look at the different partner firms who we're working with, look at their career websites and see, are they taking opportunities for 3Ls. Let's see, third question here. Can firms see the answers to all my questions? I'm glad you asked that. Absolutely not. So firms do not see individual question answers. And even if they did, it wouldn't really make a difference. And this is a really important thing. Well, let me separate those two things. Firms have no ability to access individual questions. All they see is a summary view that's rolled up into the probability score that you're seeing here shown on this page, as well as some additional detail about how all those things roll up into competencies, similar to actually what we talked about on this page, these top determining factors. They're able to see that type of data, that summary level data. They do not see individual answers. The other thing that I want to just point out is that one of the benefits of leveraging all of these different data points, remember we're looking at 100 different data points that we're collecting here, is that no one data point is going to make or break you on any of these things. One question here, one question there, 10 questions. Like it's an aggregated picture and view. It's not one thing that's going to make you a match or not make you a match. I will assure you there are no trick questions in any of this. There are no misleading questions. There's nothing that we're trying to get at that's not absolutely face value as you ultimately see it and read it. Let's see. So I'm wondering, is there data on students with GPAs that are significantly lower than the firm's thresholds? So that's a good question. So we have seen in our first couple cycles, actually, let me separate it two ways. Attorneys, current attorneys, practicing attorneys whose data we've collected, and then candidates. And in both of those cases, the answer is yes, is that GPA does not have that same level of correlation for the impact that we're ultimately seeing. Now, that being said, I don't want you to take away from this, grades no longer matter. So it doesn't, it's not an important thing for you to focus on. That you still want to obviously put up the best grades that you ultimately can. What we're doing is drawing attention to the fact that we over rely on it in the process and that they're better predictors and bringing those to bear. So we do have data on both existing attorneys who've had lower GPAs that have become very, very successful attorneys over time. And the same thing on candidates who have had lower GPAs who've gotten hired. Now, again, our first cycle was January 2020. So we haven't seen all of those candidates ultimately come through and say, how do they perform? But all of our data will tell us that they will perform just fine because we've seen practicing attorneys who are incumbents there ultimately do the same. Let's see. Jess, thank you for reminding me to flip to the Q&A page. That's my fault. We wanted to put up our contact information here as well for folks if you have any additional questions following this. So can you share more light on how firms assess themselves? For example, how does a firm determine if they are more innovative or traditional? That's a great, and then there was a follow-up about does a person in HR answer a similar questionnaire type intake? That's a really good question. So we have a data-driven approach. We don't ask firms, what do you think? What do you think is important? Which characteristics do you want to measure? Because when doing that, we're just inserting another type of bias, right? An individual's bias on what they think is important. And we're at that point in time potentially creating additional adverse impact in and around it. Our approach is we developed an assessment specifically for the legal industry that measures a broad set of characteristics around what could be important for a particular firm for practicing attorneys. And then it's through our data collection process where we'll have at any one firm, we have 100 to 500 or more attorneys go through and complete that assessment across a range of performers. We collect high performers, low performers, everywhere in between in that assessment intake and data. And then our machine learning engineers work with those data sets to say, okay, across everything that we've got self-reported from the attorneys through their completion of the assessment, and then the firm's view of performance of those individuals, that is what our machine learning engineers are working with in order to identify what combination of characteristics are actually driving success. So we take it, our view is always let the data speak for itself. When you ask somebody what they think, you're introducing the opportunity for different types of bias. Another question was, would alumni also be able to use the platform? I know Terrence does as well, love that question because our view is that we absolutely see this going out beyond just law school recruiting, right? We're not there yet, and I want to be transparent about that. So if you are an alumni, if you are a practicing attorney, somebody who's already graduated, we don't yet have that portal as a way to create that same opportunity, but we very much plan to get there. That we think all of the same issues that we've highlighted here exist in the lateral market or in the experienced hire market, and is absolutely one place that we want to be able to impact. One thing that allows us to do that, and why we always start with campus when we're moving into an industry, is it allows us to track the longitudinal nature and performance of those individuals, create models that are going to more impact people further in their careers than those coming straight out of school. See, is anybody, somebody raised their hand, I think I just got flagged that maybe somebody, there we go. Yeah.
Hi, good evening, Matt. Good evening, Terrence, Amir, and the entire Suited staff. I really appreciate you being here. My question was just basically understanding outside of just, GPA and certain, I guess, certain metrics that we can offer in our transcripts and resumes. I just want to know if you had any data on how schools determine what a quote top law school is. And further, are firms considering the capacities from other schools, irrespective of the GPA and, I guess, the GPA and resume process? So like, meaning, can they, they have 15 slots available, 5 are from Harvard, 6 are from CUNY. Now we only have 2 slots available for XYZ school or candidate. Can you speak to a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is the ever so obnoxious one of it depends. It's always a terrible answer to get. But every firm has their own thought process around the set of schools that they look at. Everybody will look at the typical sort of U.S. News rankings and law school rankings, the T14, outside the T14, down, et cetera, et cetera. But I think most every firm still also thinks about it on a geographic basis, right? Where they have offices, what are the top schools in those geographic centers that are going to be feeders. It's frankly one of the other things that gets us excited. I don't mean to pivot away from your question. One of the other things that gets us excited about this platform is that geography is becoming less important, right? In the world that we're working in today, post-COVID, a lot of firms enabling various types of remote work, ability to live different places, and particularly later in your career. All those sorts of things sort of de-emphasize geography. So we're in this lens where firms are wanting to expand their funnel or expand the funnel and expand the set of schools that they're considering for a lot of different reasons. And that school rank, again, not to say that they don't think about it or they don't care about it, but they know that the part of the problem and why there's so much competition is historically firms have focused a majority of their effort at a small set of schools. And it's harder for everybody at every other school to get their foot in the door, even though there's every bit as good a talent at those schools that are out there. It was just a capacity constraint that kept firms from being able to do that. And I know based on the partnerships that we have with the firms that we're working with and the massive number of conversations we're having across the industry, other firms, now as the industry association, et cetera, is that there's an awakening that is no longer going to be a way to actually deliver on the results that they ultimately need from a hiring perspective. So I know that's not a great answer to your question in terms of specifically here's how they do it, but the reality is every firm thinks about it differently, and every firm is at a different stage of breaking down that historical barrier or architecture around school rank.
Thank you. I just follow up. I just wanted to say I asked because as we know, Ketanji Brown Jackson is on her nomination and confirmation hearing to the Supreme Court, and a lot of her credentials are seen as pristine, particularly because she's from Harvard. I'm not mad at that. I think it's outstanding, but I also think that in the top 100, also in the top 200 and many other law schools, we don't know anything about each other's curriculums, and we just be like, oh, this school is great because they went there, and then it funnels into our government and also into our society. And I think it particularly starts from the number of students that get chosen from these schools and then get put into these big firms, and then they get to give back to the alumni association and so forth. But we never really get to discuss the differences in our curriculums and how our curriculums also make us unique. So I was wondering if there was anything in this process that can also highlight the uniqueness and the excellence of the curriculums across the law schools in America.
I think it's more, so I can't necessarily link what we're doing to be able to define and say, to give that answer that says, here's what's different about this school and this curriculum versus that school and this curriculum. What it does tell us over and over again, as Terrence talked about with the data, is that where somebody goes to law school has less importance on their future potential of being a lawyer than does all these other different things that are about them, right? So it's, and again, we've talked about all the different things that roll into who gets into what law schools and just the pure numbers game of it, and how that mentality creates all these different systemic biases and issues and exclusionary things that are perpetuating these diversity challenges that the industry ultimately has. Those are the things that we want to look to break down, because if we can break down those pieces of, we're only going to focus our recruiting on a small set of schools, it allows us to then open that funnel to a larger set of people. And as that group from more representative backgrounds and more schools, et cetera, ultimately enter and undoubtedly will be incredibly successful in those opportunities, that's going to be the eventuality of what helps to continue to break it down is, oh, now that we've cracked it, we now start to see the performance come to bear, and that these things that we're talking about that we can define with historical data, but now we're actually seeing real decisions made that have created change, and that change has been what was expected, which is that those individuals are going to be every bit a high performer as we expected.
Devon, I'd throw in two other points on what Matt said there. As he said, we can't really differentiate on an individual school basis about the nuances of curriculum and the particular skills that they impart on their students. But speaking to the network of firms that we work with, These are organizations that have embraced the idea that looking at the school pedigree is not the sole answer. Right? And they've invested time, money, and effort. And believe me, there's a significant amount of convincing that has to occur in the process as we work with these partners. It's not just done at the recruiting level. This is done all the way up through firm leadership. And so at that level, once you start to see this longitudinal value, longitudinal performance increase, people believe things that they actually see in their office. So as you bring in more people that don't come from whatever school it may be that they traditionally recruit from, and those folks perform well, suddenly it becomes very obvious that it's not a real reach to continue going out and expanding to other schools and widening this pool of candidates.
Yeah. And just to wrap, I know we're out of time and I want to be conscious of that because I know you all have, this is our day job, so we get to do this all the time. And so we're always happy to stay on and talk, but I know you all have lives outside of this. But I do want to just make a kind of a final pitch back to exactly that point. The firms that we work with are exceptional, right? They are very excited and enthusiastic about all of these ideas that we're talking about here. So I mentioned we keep an updated list on our website. Go check out those firms and go look at them because they are the ones who are forward thinking and taking those steps to do the things that we're ultimately talking about that. And I don't want to, I'm not just doing it just to plug them and Suited and whatnot, but by nature of working with us, they have this same sort of mindset. So if what we're talking about here makes sense to you, go check out those firms because they're all exceptional firms, all across. I mean, national, international, regional. We've got a great mix of firms, and it's going to continue to grow. So go look at those firms because they are all, like-minded in terms of their openness, awareness, willingness to change and to be challenged. And those are, great places to work when you have firms that are thinking that way. So I'll make a final plug for them. And then I just want to wrap by saying thank you all for the opportunity. Hopefully what you heard here was helpful as you come towards the recruiting processes. If you do have questions, feel free to reach out to us. We're always happy to engage. And we're obviously very passionate about what we do. We're committed to what we do. And so if we can be helpful in any way to you all, please don't hesitate to reach out. Our contact information is here. And with that, we'll bid everybody good night and good luck, and hope to hear from you at some point soon.
Thank you all so much. Keep doing great work. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. We will.
Have a good night.
Take care.
Take care, everyone.